September 2nd, 1945. USS Benevolence. Hospital ship, Tokyo Bay. The steel corridors of the hospital ship smell of antiseptic and fresh paint, sharp chemical cleanliness cutting through the lingering odor of diesel fuel and salt air. Nurse Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stands in the converted cargo hold that serves as a women's ward, her hand resting on the cool metal bulkhead, feeling the gentle roll of the ship at anchor. Through the porthole, she can see the gray hulls of the American fleet stretching across Tokyo Bay. Battleships, carriers, destroyers, an armada of such overwhelming power that its presence alone has ended a war. But Sarah is not looking at the fleet. She is watching the far corner of the ward, where 3 Japanese women sit on hospital cots, their backs pressed against the white-painted wall, their eyes wide with an expression Sarah has seen before in other patients, but never quite like this. Not fear of pain or death, but fear of something worse. Fear of humiliation. Fear of whatever punishment their propaganda has told them Americans inflict on captured women. They are wearing clean hospital gowns. Their wounds have been dressed. They have been given food and water. And yet they sit rigid, barely breathing, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Sarah has been a Navy nurse for 3 years, has treated burn victims and amputees and men dying from wounds no medicine can heal. She has learned to maintain professional distance, to see patients as bodies requiring care rather than as individuals with stories. But these 3 women, former military nurses themselves, captured when their hospital ship was sunk off Okinawa, have broken through that distance. Because Sarah recognizes in their faces something she has never seen in male prisoners of war. The specific terror of women who have been taught that capture means violation, that the enemy does not make distinctions between combatant and non-combatant when the captive is female. Sarah takes a breath, straightens her uniform, and walks across the ward. She does not know it yet, but this walk across 30 feet of steel deck will become one of the defining moments of her life. A moment she will describe decades later to journalists and historians trying to understand how enemies become human again. The Pacific War has been, among many other things, a war of absolute dehumanization. Both sides have spent 4 years portraying the enemy as less than human, as vermin to be exterminated, as creatures so fundamentally different that normal rules of warfare do not apply. American propaganda has depicted Japanese as subhuman monsters with buck teeth and thick glasses, sneaking and treacherous, incapable of honorable conduct. Japanese propaganda has depicted Americans as demonic beasts, rapists and murderers who desecrate the dead and torture prisoners. These are not mere exaggerations or distortions of truth. They are complete fabrications designed to make killing easier, to remove moral hesitation, to transform warfare into extermination. And they have worked terribly well. The Pacific War has produced atrocities on a scale that shocks even the hardened veterans of the European theater. Prisoners have been tortured and executed. Wounded have been left to die or finished off. Surrender has become unthinkable for Japanese soldiers because they have been taught to believe, that capture means torture and death. The result is a war where quarter is neither asked nor given, where every battle becomes a fight to mutual annihilation. But among the millions of men who fought this war, there were also women, not in combat roles. Neither side deployed women as infantry or aircrew, but in supporting positions that nevertheless placed them in harm's way. Nurses, clerks, radio operators, factory workers in forward areas, civilians caught in combat zones. These women experienced the war differently than men, with an additional layer of vulnerability that both sides understood but rarely discussed openly. A male soldier captured by the enemy might expect harsh treatment, imprisonment, perhaps execution if battlefield passion runs high. A female soldier or civilian captured by the enemy might expect all of that plus sexual violence. A threat so pervasive that Japanese military authorities issued cyanide capsules to female personnel with instructions to commit suicide rather than allow capture. American women serving in the Pacific were warned, in training that tried to be clinical but could not quite mask the underlying dread that capture by Japanese forces would likely result in assault and murder. These were not empty threats. Both sides had evidence of atrocities against women. Both sides used that evidence to reinforce the narrative that the enemy was beyond civilization, beyond redemption. The 3 Japanese women in the USS Benevolence's ward are survivors of the hospital ship Tachibana Maru, torpedoed by an American submarine off Okinawa in June 1945. They are military nurses, members of the Imperial Japanese Navy's medical service, trained professionals who have spent the war caring for wounded soldiers in field hospitals across the Pacific. They have seen horrors, men burned beyond recognition, amputations performed without anesthesia, patients dying from infections because antibiotics are unavailable. They have worked 18-hour shifts in sweltering heat, have gone days without adequate food or water, have maintained medical discipline even as the strategic situation collapsed around them. They are not warriors in the conventional sense, but they are absolutely military personnel, bound by orders and duty, indoctrinated with the same ideology that has sent kamikaze pilots into American ships and infantry into suicidal banzai charges. When the Tachibana Maru took a torpedo amidships and began sinking, these 3 women, Sachiko Watanabe, age 26, Keiko Yamamoto, age 23, Fumiko Tanaka, age 28, found themselves in the water with hundreds of others. The ship went down in less than 8 minutes. Most of those aboard died in the initial explosion or drowned in the chaos that followed. The 3 nurses survived by clinging to debris, by helping each other stay afloat through the night, by sheer luck and determination. They were picked up 36 hours later by an American destroyer, more dead than alive, suffering from hypothermia and saltwater exposure. They expected immediate execution. Japanese propaganda had been explicit. American forces do not take prisoners, especially female prisoners. The Americans would rape them and then kill them, or perhaps kill them and then desecrate their bodies. Either way, death was certain, and the only question was how much suffering would precede it. Instead, they were wrapped in blankets, given water and medical attention, treated with a gentleness that made no sense within their understanding of how war works. They were transferred to the hospital ship Benevolence, where their injuries, severe dehydration, exposure, infected wounds from the sinking, were treated with the same care given to American casualties. They were fed, given clean clothes, assigned beds in a proper hospital ward, and they waited for the trap to spring, for the facade of civility to drop and the real horror to begin. Because this solicitous treatment could only be a prelude to something worse. The Americans were playing with them, giving them hope only to make the eventual betrayal more devastating. This was psychological torture, a refinement of cruelty that confirmed everything they had been taught about American barbarism. Nurse Sarah Mitchell has no knowledge of these thoughts as she approaches the 3 women. She has been briefed on their medical conditions, but not their psychological state, not the specific terrors that Japanese propaganda has implanted. She sees 3 patients who are physically recovering but emotionally withdrawn, who accept treatment passively but show no signs of relief or gratitude, who watch the medical staff with expressions that trouble her professional conscience. Sarah has treated enemy wounded before, Japanese soldiers pulled from battlefield aid stations, burned and broken, many of them delirious with pain. But those men were enemy combatants, and their fear of American captivity, while present, was tempered by the warrior culture that taught them to accept death stoically. These women are different. Their fear is not of death, but of something more intimate, more personal, more unbearable. Sarah stops at the foot of Sachiko Watanabe's bed. Sachiko is the oldest of the 3 and has emerged as their informal leader. She stares at Sarah with an expression that tries for defiance, but cannot quite hide the underlying terror. Sarah has practiced this moment in her mind, has considered how to bridge the impossible gulf between them. She has no translator present. That is intentional, a decision to make this interaction personal rather than mediated by official process. She smiles, a professional nurse's smile that she hopes will transcend language barriers. She says in English, knowing it will not be understood, but hoping the tone will communicate what words cannot. "You're safe here. We're going to take care of you. The symbolic object that will come to define this moment, this transformation, is not a weapon or even food. It is something simpler and more profound, the nurse's cap. Sarah reaches up and adjusts her own cap, the white fabric with its crisp folds that marks her as a medical professional. Then she points to her cap, to herself, and then to Sachiko. The gesture is simple. You and I wear the same uniform. You and I perform the same function. We are colleagues, not enemies. We are nurses, and nurses care for the sick regardless of which flag they serve. Sachiko stares at Sarah, processing this gesture. She has been a military nurse for 4 years, has worn her own nurse's cap with pride, has understood herself as part of a noble profession that transcends the brutality of war. But her cap was lost in the sinking, along with everything else she owned. She is wearing a hospital gown, her identity as a medical professional erased along with her uniform. And now this American nurse is offering recognition of that identity, is suggesting a shared professional bond that propaganda insists cannot exist between Japanese and Americans. The cognitive dissonance is overwhelming. Sachiko's training, her indoctrination, her understanding of reality all insist that this must be a trick, a manipulation. But 4 years of nursing, of caring for patients, of understanding the medical profession as fundamentally humanitarian suggests something else, that perhaps, in this one specific context, the propaganda is wrong. The weeks following Japan's surrender see a flood of former prisoners and displaced persons requiring medical care. The scale is staggering. Hundreds of thousands of individuals who have spent years in various states of captivity or hiding, who emerge from camps and jungle hideouts malnourished, diseased, traumatized. American military medical facilities in the Pacific Theater are overwhelmed, operating far beyond design capacity. Hospital ships like the Benevolence become floating cities of recovery, processing thousands of patients, performing triage on a scale never before attempted. In this chaos, the 3 Japanese nurses remain in their corner of the women's ward, receiving treatment but isolated from the larger patient population by language and expectation. Sarah Mitchell makes a decision that is not authorized by any regulation she can point to. She begins teaching the 3 women basic medical English, not conversational language, but the specific terminology of nursing care. Wound dressing, vital signs, medication. She does this during her off-duty hours, sitting with them in the ward, using pantomime and sketches when words fail. It is not official rehabilitation, not sanctioned by the chain of command, just one nurse recognizing fellow nurses and trying to bridge the gap. And slowly, incrementally, the 3 Japanese women begin to respond. Not with trust, not yet, but with professional interest. They ask questions in halting English and Japanese mixed together about American medical techniques. They demonstrate Japanese methods for wound care and fracture stabilization, techniques Sarah has never encountered. They begin to function not as patients, but as colleagues, sharing knowledge across the barrier of enmity. The transformation accelerates when casualties from the occupation force begin arriving with injuries from accidents and minor conflicts. The hospital ship staff is stretched thin, and Sarah makes another unauthorized decision. She asks the 3 Japanese nurses if they will help. The request is absurd on multiple levels. They are technically prisoners of war, though the term has lost meaning in the chaos following surrender. They have no official status, no authorization to work, no protection under military regulations. They could refuse, or worse, could use access to American patients to cause harm, contaminate wounds, administer wrong medications, sabotage treatment. The risk is real, but Sarah sees in their faces the same dedication she feels, the same professional compulsion that makes a nurse want to help the suffering regardless of context. Sachiko confers with Keiko and Fumiko in rapid Japanese. The conversation is brief. Then she turns to Sarah and says, in careful English, "We help. We are nurse." It is perhaps the first complete English sentence she has managed, and the grammar is broken, but the meaning is crystalline. Identity before nationality. Profession before politics. We are nurses, and nurses help. What follows is unprecedented in the Pacific Theater's medical history, possibly in the history of warfare. 3 Japanese military nurses, former enemies, working alongside American medical staff to treat American service members. The initial arrangements are awkward, heavy with supervision and suspicion from American personnel who cannot quite believe this is happening. But the Japanese nurses are competent. More than competent, they are skilled professionals with years of battlefield experience. They know how to work in austere conditions, how to improvise when supplies are inadequate, how to maintain sterile technique under pressure. They know, above all, how to comfort suffering patients, a skill that transcends language and nationality. The American patients' reactions vary. Some refuse treatment from Japanese nurses, their hatred of the enemy still too fresh, their losses too recent. Others, particularly those who have been wounded multiple times and have developed the soldier's pragmatic attitude toward medical care, accept treatment without comment. A few, surprisingly, express something approaching gratitude. These men have spent years seeing Japanese only as targets, and the cognitive dissonance of being cared for by enemy nurses forces a reevaluation that is psychologically uncomfortable but ultimately humanizing. The symbolic moment that cements this transformation occurs 3 weeks after Sarah's initial approach. An American sailor is brought aboard with severe burns from an engine room fire. He is unconscious, in shock, his condition critical. Sarah is the senior nurse on duty, and she immediately begins organizing the trauma response. She calls for assistance, and Sachiko responds without hesitation, moving into position as Sarah's primary assistant, as if they have worked together for years. For the next 6 hours, the 2 women, American and Japanese, victor and vanquished, representatives of nations that have spent 4 years trying to annihilate each other, work in perfect professional synchronization to save this sailor's life. They do not speak except in medical terminology. They do not need to. The choreography of emergency medicine is universal, and both women know the steps. The sailor survives. When he regains consciousness 2 days later and learns that one of the nurses who saved his life was Japanese, his reaction is complex. He does not express gratitude initially. The psychological adjustment is too difficult, too threatening to his understanding of the war and his place in it. But he does not protest either. He accepts the continuation of care from Sachiko when she checks his dressings and administers medication. And when he is eventually discharged, he makes a point of finding Sarah and asking, through her, that Sachiko be thanked. The message is delivered through translation and formal military courtesy, stripped of personal emotion. But the fact of the message matters more than its content. Recognition has been given. Humanity has been acknowledged. Word of the Japanese nurses' work spreads through unofficial channels. Letters home, conversations between ships, the informal network that exists in any military organization. The official response is ambiguous. No orders come to stop the arrangement, but no official authorization is granted either. It exists in a bureaucratic limbo, tolerated because it is useful and because the immediate post-surrender period is too chaotic for anyone to worry about procedural irregularities. The 3 Japanese nurses continue to work, their status evolving from prisoners to patients to something that has no clear definition. Collaborators in recovery, participants in the transformation from war to peace. But the profound transformation is not in official policy or military doctrine. It is in the individual consciousness of the women involved. Sachiko, Keiko, and Fumiko have spent their adult lives serving an ideology that defined them as subjects of the divine emperor, members of a superior race destined to rule Asia, participants in a sacred mission that justified any sacrifice. That ideology has collapsed, utterly and completely, with Japan's surrender. The emperor himself has announced in his surrender broadcast that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, a phrase so divorced from reality that it would be comical if the reality were not so devastating. Everything they were taught to believe about Japanese invincibility, about the cowardice of Americans, about the righteousness of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, has been proven false. They're facing not just military defeat, but ideological annihilation, the destruction of the entire framework through which they understood their lives and purposes. That in this void, nursing becomes the anchor. The profession, with its clear ethics and universal humanitarian purpose, offers a foundation when everything else has crumbled. Sarah Mitchell's recognition of them as fellow nurses, her gesture with the nurse's cap, her invitation to work as colleagues rather than be treated as enemies. These acts offer a path forward, a way to reconstruct identity from the ruins of the old order. If they cannot be loyal subjects of the empire because the empire has ended, they can still be nurses. If they cannot serve Japan because Japan has surrendered, they can serve patients. The profession transcends the nation. The humanitarian mission survives the military defeat. Sarah Mitchell's transformation is perhaps less dramatic, but no less real. She has spent 3 years seeing the war through the lens of American propaganda. The Japanese as treacherous, cruel, fundamentally alien. She has treated American servicemen who were captured at Bataan and survived the death march, who carry in their bodies and psyches the evidence of systematic brutality. She knows intellectually that the Japanese committed atrocities, that the war in the Pacific was in many ways a war without mercy. But working with Sachiko, Keiko, and Fumiko forces her to recognize that propaganda and reality are not the same thing, that the Japanese are not a monolithic enemy, but individuals with their own stories, their own skills, their own moral frameworks. The 3 women she works with are not monsters. They're nurses who have seen terrible things and continue to care for the wounded. They are, in every way that matters professionally, her sisters. The word sister has specific meaning in nursing culture. It is both a formal title in some medical systems and an informal recognition of shared professional identity. When Sarah, in a moment of exhaustion after a particularly difficult surgery, turns to Sachiko and says, "Good work, sister," the term slipping out unthinkingly, the word carries weight far beyond its literal meaning. Sachiko understands enough English to catch the word, to recognize its significance. Her eyes widen slightly, and for the first time since her capture, she smiles. It is a small smile, tentative, not quite trusting, but genuine. She has been recognized not as enemy, not as prisoner, not as patient, but as colleague, as sister. This recognition spreads, slowly and unevenly, through the medical staff. Other nurses begin referring to the 3 Japanese women as the sisters, a term that starts as simple identification but gradually takes on deeper meaning. When Fumiko successfully manages a complicated childbirth, a Japanese civilian woman found in the ruins of Tokyo, brought aboard for emergency obstetric care. The American medical staff's congratulations are professional and warm, devoid of the awkwardness that characterized earlier interactions. When Keiko demonstrates a Japanese technique for managing abdominal wounds that proves more effective than the standard American method, the technique is adopted without comment on its origin. The women are being integrated not through official policy, but through professional respect, through the recognition that skill and dedication matter more than nationality. The symbolic power of the nurse's cap reaches its apex when, in late October 1945, an official Red Cross delegation visits the benevolence to assess medical operations. The delegation includes several senior American nurses, career medical professionals with decades of experience. They tour the facility, observe procedures, review patient outcomes. And they notice, of course, the 3 Japanese women working alongside American staff. The question is raised, what is the status of these individuals? Are they prisoners? Patients? Volunteers? The answer is unclear because the situation has evolved organically, without paperwork or official orders. The delegation's senior nurse, a formidable woman named Margaret Brennan who has served in 2 wars, observes Sachiko managing post-operative care for an American patient. She watches the skill, the gentleness, the professional competence. Then she turns to Sarah Mitchell and asks a question that will determine the 3 Japanese women's fate. Is she a qualified nurse? Sarah, recognizing that everything depends on this moment, answers without hesitation, "Yes, ma'am." She's one of the best nurses I've worked with. Margaret Brennan nods once, decisively. She summons Sachiko, who approaches with obvious trepidation, expecting censure or worse. Instead, Margaret removes her own spare nurse's cap from her bag. She carries spares, an old habit from years of training young nurses, and places it on Sachiko's head. The gesture is formal, almost ritualistic. Then she says, speaking slowly so Sachiko can understand, "You are a nurse. Wear this with honor." Sachiko stands frozen, one hand rising slowly to touch the cap, her face struggling through emotions too complex for expression. She has been a nurse for 4 years without a cap, the symbol of her profession lost in the sinking. Now an American nurse, a representative of the enemy nation, has given her a replacement, has recognized her professional identity, has called her a nurse, without qualification or hesitation. Sachiko's eyes fill with tears, and she bows deeply, the formal Japanese bow that expresses profound gratitude and respect. Margaret Brennan, who does not fully understand the cultural significance but recognizes the emotional weight, returns the bow awkwardly. Then she extends her hand. Sachiko, who has never shaken hands in her life, the gesture is alien to Japanese culture, hesitates only a moment before taking it. The photograph of that handshake, taken by a Navy public affairs officer who happened to be present, becomes one of the iconic images of the Pacific War's end. It is not widely published at the time. The public appetite for stories of reconciliation with the Japanese is limited in late 1945, when memories of Pearl Harbor and the Bataan Death March remain raw. But the photograph circulates within medical circles, and decades later will be rediscovered and reprinted in histories of military nursing. Two women, American and Japanese, one elderly and one young, shaking hands across the gap of enmity. Behind them, blurred but visible, Sarah Mitchell watches with an expression of quiet satisfaction. She has helped to engineer this moment, this recognition of shared humanity and professional identity. It is, in its way, as significant a victory as any won on battlefields. The 3 Japanese nurses continue working aboard the Benevolence until the ship returns to the United States in December 1945. At that point, bureaucracy finally catches up with the irregular arrangement. The women are officially classified as displaced persons, granted temporary resident status, and transferred to civilian custody. They are offered positions with the American Red Cross, working in medical facilities treating repatriated Japanese civilians. The work is less dramatic than wartime trauma care, but it is meaningful, and it allows them to continue functioning as nurses during Japan's slow, painful recovery. Sarah Mitchell maintains correspondence with Sachiko for 37 years, until Sachiko's death in 1982. The letters, preserved in Sarah's papers and later donated to the Navy Nurse Corps archives, document the evolution of their relationship from wartime colleagues to lifelong friends. They are not frequent correspondence. Sometimes a year passes between letters, but the connection remains. Sachiko describes the rebuilding of Japan, the transformation of nursing education, the struggle to create a medical system from the ruins of war. Sarah describes her own post-war career, her marriage and family, her work training young nurses. In neither set of letters is there much discussion of the war itself. The focus is forward, on building and healing rather than dwelling on destruction. But in one letter, written in 1970, when both women are in their 50s, Sachiko reflects on the moment aboard the Benevolence when Sarah first approached her, when a simple gesture of pointing to nurses' caps bridged the unbridgeable. Sachiko writes, in English that has become fluent over decades, "I believed Americans were devils. I believed capture meant death or worse. When you call me sister, when you asked me to help care for patients, you destroyed that belief. You showed me that the propaganda was lies, that the enemy was human, that nurses are nurses regardless of nationality. This was more difficult than accepting military defeat. Military defeat, I could understand. We lost because America was stronger. But accepting that our entire ideology was false, that we had been taught lies about human nature itself, this was devastating and liberating at the same time. You gave me a new foundation when the old one collapsed. You saved my life, not in the medical sense, but in the deeper sense of giving me a reason to continue living when everything I believed was proven wrong. The transformation that occurred aboard the USS Benevolence in the autumn of 1945 was replicated, on smaller scales and with less documentation, across the Pacific theater as the war ended and the occupation began. Enemies became individuals. Stereotypes encountered reality. The propaganda of dehumanization, so carefully constructed and maintained during the war years, began to crumble when Japanese and Americans interacted as people rather than as abstractions. This process was uneven, incomplete, often grudging. Many veterans on both sides never fully overcame their wartime hatreds. Many Japanese civilians, especially those who lost family members to American bombing, struggled to accept American occupation. Many American servicemen, especially those who had been prisoners of war, could not forgive Japanese atrocities. The scars of the war were too deep for easy healing.